10. His ship and his fellow voyagers waited at Pylos but for a while longer. Telemachus bided in Sparta, for he would fain hear from Menelaus and from Helen the tale of Troy. Many days he stayed, and on the first day Menelaus told him of Achilles, the greatest of the heroes who had fought against Troy. And on another day the lady Helen told him of Hector, the noblest of all the men who defended King Priam's city. Achilles said King Menelaus was sprung of a race that was favored by the immortals. Peleus, the father of Achilles, had for his friend Charon, the wisest of the centaurs, of those immortals who are half men and half horse. Charon it was who gave to Peleus his great spear, and when Peleus desired to wed an immortal, Zeus, the greatest of the gods, prevailed upon the nymph Thetis to marry him, although marriage with a mortal was against her will. To the wedding of Thetis and Peleus all the gods came, and for wedding gifts Zeus gave such armor as no mortal had ever worn before, armor wonderfully bright and wonderfully strong, and he gave also 2 immortal horses. Achilles was the child of Thetis and Peleus, of an immortal woman married to a mortal hero. He grew up most strong and fleet of foot. When he was grown to be a youth, he was sent to Charon, and his father's friend instructed him in all the ways of war. He became the greatest of spearmen, and on the mountain with the centaur he gained in strength and in fleetness of foot. Now after he returned to his father's hall, the war against Troy began to be prepared for. Agamemnon the king wanted Achilles to join the host, but Thetis, knowing that great disasters would befall those who went to that war, feared for Achilles. She resolved to hide him so that no word from King Agamemnon might reach him. And how did the nymph Thetis hide her son? She sent him to King Lycomedes and prayed the king to hide Achilles amongst his daughters. So the youth Achilles was dressed as a maiden and stayed with the daughters of the king. The messengers of Agamemnon searched everywhere for him. Many of them came to the court of King Lycomedes, but not finding one like Achilles amongst the king's sons, they went away. Odysseus, by Agamemnon's order, came to seek Achilles. He knew that the youth was not amongst the king's sons. He saw the king's daughters in their father's orchard, but could not tell if Achilles was amongst them, for all were veiled and dressed alike. Then Odysseus went away and returned as a peddler, carrying in his pack such things as maidens admire, veils and ornaments and brazen mirrors. But under the veils and ornaments and mirrors the wise Odysseus left a gleaming sword. When he came before the maidens in the king's orchard, he laid down his peddler's pack. The mirrors and veils and ornaments were taken up and examined eagerly, but one of the company took up the gleaming sword and looked at it with flashing eyes. Odysseus knew that this was Achilles, King Peleus' son. He gave the youth the summons of King Agamemnon, bidding him join the war that the kings and princes of Greece were about to wage against Troy. And Achilles was glad to get the summons and glad to go. He returned to Phthia, to his father's citadel. There did he make ready to go to Aulis, where the ships were being gathered. He took with him his father's famous warriors, the Myrmidons, who were never beaten in battle, and his father bestowed on him the armor and the horses that had been the gift of Zeus, the 2 immortal horses, Xanathus and Balios. But what rejoiced Achilles more than the gift of marvelous armor and immortal steeds was that his dear comrade Patroclus was to be with him as his mate in war. Patroclus had come into Phthia and into the hall of Peleus when he was a young boy. In his own country he had killed another boy by mischance over a game of dice. His father, to save him from the penalty, fled with him to King Peleus, And Achilles his father gave them refuge and took Patroclus into his house and reared him up with his own son. Later he made him squire to Achilles. These two grew together, and more than brothers they loved each other. Achilles bade goodbye to Phthia and to his hero father and his immortal mother, and he and Patroclus with the Myrmidons went over the sea to Aulis and joined the host of the kings and princes who had made a vow not to refrain from war until they had taken King Priam's famous city. 11. Achilles became the most renowned of all the heroes who strove against Troy in the years the fighting went on. Before the sight of him, clad in the flashing armor that was the gift of Zeus, and standing in the chariot drawn by the immortal horses, the Trojan ranks would break, and the Trojan men would flee back to the gate of their city, and many lesser cities and towns around Troy did the host with the help of Achilles take. Now, because of two maidens taken captive from some of these cities, a quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon grew up. One of the maidens was called Chryseis, and the other Briseis. Chryseis was given to Agamemnon and Briseis to Achilles. The father of Chryseis was a priest of Apollo, and when the maiden, his daughter, was not given back to him, he went and prayed the god to avenge him on the host. Apollo listened to his prayer, and straightway the god left his mountain peak with his bow of silver in his hands. He stood behind the ships and shot his arrows into the host. Terrible was the clanging of his silver bow. He smote the beasts of the camp first, the dogs and the mules and the horses, and then he smote the men, and those whom his arrows smote were stricken by the plague. The warriors began to die, and every day more perished by the plague than were killed by the spears and swords and arrows of the Trojans. Now a council was summoned, and the chiefs debated what was to be done to save the host. At the council there was a soothsayer named Calchas. He stood up and declared that he knew the cause of the plague, and he knew too how much the remainder of the host might be saved from it. It was because of the anger of Apollo, Calchas said, and that anger could only be averted by Agamemnon sending back to his father, the priest of Apollo, the maiden Chryseis. Then was Agamemnon wroth exceedingly. Thou seer of things evil, said he to Calchas, never didst thou see aught of good for me to mine, the maiden given to me, Chryseis, a greatly prize. Yet rather than my folk should perish, I shall let her be taken from me. But this let you all the council know. Some other prize must be given to me, that the whole host may know that Agamemnon is not slighted. Then said Achilles, Agamemnon, of all kings you are the most covetous. The best of us toil and battle, that you may come and take what part of the spoil may please you. Be covetous no more. Let this maiden go back to her father, and afterwards we will give you some other prize. Said Agamemnon, the council here must bind itself to give me recompense. Still you speak of recompense, Agamemnon, answered Achilles. No one gains more than you gain. I had no quarrel with the men of Troy, and yet I have come here, and my hands bear the brunt of the war. You who are captains must give me a recompense, and Agamemnon, or else I shall go to the tent of Achilles and take away the maiden given to him, Briseis of the fair cheeks. I am wearied of making war for you, answered Achilles, though I am always in the strife, but little of the spoil comes to my tent. Now will I depart to my own land, to Phthia, for I am not minded to stay here and be dishonored by you, O king. Go, said Agamemnon. If your soul be set upon fleeing, go. But do not think that there are no captains and heroes here who can make war without you. Go and lord it amongst your Myrmidons. Never shall we seek your aid, and that all may know I am greater than you. Achilles, I shall go to your tent and take away the maiden Briseis. When he heard Agamemnon's speech, the heart within Achilles' breast was divided, and he knew not whether he should remain still and silent in his anger, or thrust the counsel aside, go up to Agamemnon and slay him with the sword. His hand was upon the sword hilt when an immortal appeared to him, the goddess Athene. No one in the company but Achilles was aware of her presence. Draw not the sword upon Agamemnon, she said, for equally dear to the gods are you both. Then Achilles drew back and thrust his heavy sword into its sheath again. But although he held his hand, he did not refrain from angry and bitter words. He threw down on the ground the staff that had been put into his hands as a sign that he was to be listened to in the council. By this staff that no more shall bear leaf or blossom, he said, I swear that longing for Achilles' aid shall come upon the host of Agamemnon, but that no Achilles shall come to their help. I swear that I shall let Hector triumph over you. Then the council broke up, and Achilles with Patroclus, his dear comrade, went back to the tent. A ship was launched, and the maiden Chryseis was put aboard, and Odysseus was placed in command. The ship set out for Chryse. There on the beach they found the priest of Apollo, and Odysseus placed his daughter in the old man's arms. They made sacrifice to Apollo, and thereafter the plague was averted from the host. But to Achilles' tent there came the messenger of the king, and they took Briseis of the fair cheeks and led her away. Achilles, in bitter anger, sat by the sea, hard in his resolve not to help Agamemnon's men, no matter what defeat great Hector inflicted upon them. 12. Such was the quarrel, dear son, between Agamemnon, king of men, and great Achilles. Ah, because of that quarrel, many brave men and great captains whom I remember went down to their deaths. But Agamemnon before long relented, and he sent 3 envoys to make friendship between himself and Achilles. The envoys were Odysseus and Aias, and the old man Phoenix, who had been a foster father to Achilles. Now when these 3 went into his hut, they found Achilles sitting with a lyre in his hands, singing to the music he made. His song was what Thetis, his goddess mother, had told him concerning his own fate, how if he remained in the war against Troy, he should win for himself imperishable renown, but would soon lose his life, and how if he left the war, his years in his own land should be long, although no great renown would be his. Patroclus, his dear friend, listened to what Achilles sang, and Achilles sang of what royal state would be his if he gave up the war against the Trojans, and went back to his father's halls. Old Peleus would welcome him, and he would seek a bride for him from amongst the loveliest of the Greek maidens. In 3 days he sang, Can Poseidon, god of the sea, bring me to my own land and to my father's royal castle? Well dost thou sing, Achilles, said Odysseus to him, and pleasant would it be to hear thy song if our hearts were not filled up with great griefs. But have not 9 years passed away since we came here to make war on Troy? And now are not our ships' timbers rotted and their tacklings loosed? And do not many of our warriors think in their hearts how their wives and children have long been waiting for their return? And still the walls of Troy rise up before us as high and as unconquerable as ever. No wonder our hearts are filled up with griefs. And now Achilles, the greatest of our heroes, and the Myrmidons, the best of our warriors, have left us and gone out of the fight. Even today, great Hector turned back our battalions that were led by Agamemnon and Aias and Diomedes, driving us to the wall that we have built around our ships. Behind that wall, we halted and called one to the other to find out who had escaped and who had fallen in the onslaught Hector made. Only when he had driven us behind our wall did Hector turn back his chariot and draw off his men. But Hector has not gone through the gates of the city. Look now, Achilles, his chariots remain on the plain. Lo now his watch fires. 1,000 fires thou canst see, and beside each sits 50 warriors with their horses, loose beside their chariots, champing barley. Eagerly they wait for the light of the dawn, when they will come against us again, hoping this time to overthrow the wall we have builded, and come to our ships and burn them with fire, and so destroy all hope of our return. We are all stricken with grief and fear. Even Agamemnon weeps. We have seen him standing before us like unto a dark fountain breaking from some beetling cliff. How else could he but weep tears? Tomorrow it may be he shall have to bid the host draw the ships to the water and depart from the coast of Troy. Then will his name forever be dishonored because of defeat and the loss of so many warriors. Deemst thou I grieve for Agamemnon's griefs, Odysseus? Said Achilles, but although thou dost speak of Agamemnon, thou art welcome, thou and thy companions. Even in my wrath, you three are dear to me. He brought them within the hut and bade a feast be prepared for them. To Odysseus, Aias, and Phoenix wine cups were handed. And when they had feasted and drunk wine, Odysseus turned to where Achilles sat on his bench in the light of the fire and said, Know, Achilles, that we three are here as envoys from King Agamemnon. He would make a friendship with thee again. He has injured and he has offended thee, but all that a man can do he will do to make amends. The maiden Briseis he will let go back. Many gifts will he give thee too. Achilles, he will give thee 7 tripods and 20 cauldrons and 10 talents of gold. Yes, and besides 12 royal horses, each one of which has triumphed in some race. He who possesses these horses will never lack for wealth as long as prizes are to be won by swiftness. And hearken to what more Agamemnon bade us say to thee. If we win Troy, he will let thee load your ship with spoil of the city, with gold and bronze and precious stuffs. And thereafter, if we win to our homes, he will treat thee as his own royal son, and will give thee 7 cities to rule over. And if thou wilt wed, there are 3 daughters in his hall, 3 of the fairest maidens of the Greeks, and the one thou wilt choose he will give thee for thy wife, Chrysothemis, or Laodice, or Iphianassa. So Odysseus spoke, and then Aias said, Think, Achilles, and abandon now thy wrath. If Agamemnon be hateful to thee, and if thou despisest his gifts, think upon thy friends and thy companions, and have pity upon them, even for our sakes. Achilles, arise now and go into battle, and stay the onslaught of the terrible Hector. Achilles did not answer. His lion's eyes were fixed upon those who had spoken, and his look did not change at all for all that was said. Then the old man Phoenix, who had nurtured him, went over to him. He could not speak, for tears had burst from him. But at last, holding Achilles' hands, he said, In thy father's house did I not rear thee to greatness, even thee, most noble Achilles? With me and with none other wouldst thou go into the feast hall, and as a child thou wouldst stay at my knee, and eat the morsel I gave, and drink from the cup that I put to thy lips. I reared thee, and I suffered and toiled much, that thou mightest have strength and skill and quickness. Be thou merciful in thy heart, Achilles, be not wrathful any more. Cast aside thine anger now, and save the host. Come now. The gifts Agamemnon would give thee are very great, and no king nor prince could despise them. But if without gifts thou wouldest enter the battle, then above all heroes the host would honor thee. Achilles answered Phoenix gently and said, The honor the host would bestow upon me I have no need of, for I am honored in the judgment of Zeus, the greatest of the gods. And while breath remains with me, that honor cannot pass away. But do thou, Phoenix, stay with me, and many things I shall bestow upon thee, even the half of my kingdom. Ah, but urge me not to help Agamemnon, for if thou dost, I shall look upon thee as a friend to Agamemnon, and I shall hate thee, my foster father, as I hate him. Then to Odysseus Achilles spoke and said, Son of Laertes, wisest of men, hearken now to what I shall say to thee. Here I should have stayed and won that imperishable renown that my goddess mother told me of, even at the cost of my young life, if Agamemnon had not aroused the wrath that now possesses me. Know that my soul is implacable towards him. How often did I watch out sleepless nights? How often did I spend my days in bloody battle for the sake of Agamemnon's and his brother's cause? Why are we here if not because of lovely Helen? And yet one whom I cherish as Menelaus cherished Helen has been taken from me by order of the king. He would let her go her way now. But no, I do not desire to see Briseis ever again, for everything that comes from Agamemnon's hand is hateful to me. Hateful are all the gifts he would bestow upon me, and him and his treasures I hold at a straw's worth. I have chosen. Tomorrow I shall have my Myrmidons draw my ships out to the sea, and I shall depart from Troy from my own land. Said Aias, have the gods, Achilles, put into your breast a spirit implacable and proud above all men's spirits? Yes, Aias, said Achilles, my spirit cannot contain my wrath. Agamemnon has treated me not as a leader of armies who won many battles for him, but as a vile sojourner in his camp. Go now and declare my will to him. Never again shall I take thought of his war. So he spoke, and each man took a two-handled cup and poured out wine as an offering to the gods. Then Odysseus and Aias in sadness left the hut. But Phoenix remained, and for him Patroclus, the dear friend of Achilles, spread a couch of fleeces and rugs. Odysseus and Aias went along the shore of the sea and by the line of the ships, and they came to where Agamemnon was with the greatest of the warriors of the host. Odysseus told them that by no means would Achilles join in the battle, and they all were made silent with grief. Then Diomedes, the great horseman, rose up and said, Let Achilles stay or go, fight or not fight as it pleases him. But it is for us who have made a vow to take Priam's city, to fight on. Let us take food and rest now, and tomorrow let us go against Hector's host, and you, Agamemnon, take the foremost place in the battle. So Diomedes spoke, and the warriors applauded what he said, and they all poured out libations of wine to the gods, and thereafter they went to their huts and slept. But for Agamemnon, the king, there was no sleep that night. Before his eyes was the blaze of Hector's 1,000 watchfires, and in his ears were the sound of pipes and flutes that made war music for the Trojan host encamped upon the plain. 13. When dawn came, the king arrayed himself for the battle, putting on his great breastplate and his helmet that had a high plume of horsehair, fastening about his legs greaves fitted with ankle clasps of silver, and hanging round his shoulder a great sword that shone with studs of gold. A sword that had a silver scabbard fitted with golden chains. Over his shoulders he cast a great lion's skin, and he took upon his arm a shield that covered the whole of a man. Next he took in his hands 2 strong spears of bronze, and so arrayed and so armed he was ready to take the foremost place in the battle. He cried aloud and bade the Greeks arm themselves, and straightway they did so and poured from behind the wall that guarded their ships into the Trojan plain. Then the chiefs mounted their chariots, and their charioteers turned the horses towards the place of battle. Now on the high ground before them the Trojans had gathered in their battalions, and the figure of great Hector was plain to Agamemnon and his men. Like a star that now and then was hidden by a cloud, so he appeared as he went through the battalions, all covered with shining bronze. Spears and arrows fell upon both sides. Footmen kept slaying footmen, and horsemen kept slaying horsemen with the sword. And the dust of the plain rose up, stirred by the thundering hooves of the horses. From dawn till morning, and from morning till noon, the battle raged. But at midday the Greeks broke through the Trojan lines, Then Agamemnon and his chariot rushed through a gap in the line. 2 men did he instantly slay, and dashing onward he slew 2 warriors who were the sons of King Priam. Like fire falling upon a wood and burning up the underwood, went King Agamemnon through the Trojan ranks. And when he passed, many strong-necked horses rattled empty chariots, leaving on the earth the slain warriors that had been in them. And through the press of men and up to the high walls of Troy did Agamemnon go, slaying Trojan warriors with his spear. Hector did not go nigh him, for the gods had warned Hector not to lead any onslaught until Agamemnon had turned back from battle. But a Trojan warrior smote King Agamemnon on the mid-arm below the elbow, and the point of his spear went clean through. Still he went through the ranks of the Trojans, slaying with spear and sword, and then the blood dried upon his wound, and a sharp pain came upon him, and he cried out, O friends and captains, it is not possible for me to war forever against the Trojans, but do you fight on to keep the battle from our ships? His charioteer turned his horses, and they all covered with foam and grimed with dust, dashed back across the plain, bearing the wounded king from the day's battle. Then Hector sprang to the onslaught. Leaping into his chariot, he led the Trojans on. 9 captains of the Greeks he slew in the first onset. Now their ranks would have been broken, and the Greeks would have fled back to their ships if Odysseus had not been on the wing of the battle with Diomedes, the great horseman. Odysseus cried out, Come hither, Diomedes, or verily Hector will sweep across the plain and bring the battle down to our ships. Then these 2 forced themselves through the press of battle and held back the onset of Hector till the Greeks had their chance to rally. Hector spied them and swept in his chariot towards them. Diomedes lifted his great spear and flung it full at Hector. The bronze of the spear struck the bronze of his helmet, and the bronze by bronze was turned. The blow told upon Hector, but he, springing from his chariot, stayed amongst the press of warriors, resting himself on his hands and knees. Darkness was before his eyes for a while, but he got breath again, and leaping back into his chariot, drove away from that dangerous place. Then Diomedes himself received a bitterer wound, for Paris, sheltering himself behind a pillar on the plain, let fly an arrow at him. It went clean through his right foot. Odysseus put his shield before his friend and comrade, and Diomedes was able to draw the arrow from his flesh. But Diomedes was fain to get back into his chariot and to command his charioteer to drive from the battle. Now Odysseus was the only one of the captains who stayed on that side of the battle, and the ranks of the Trojans came on and hemmed him round. One warrior struck at the center of his shield, and through the shield the strong Trojan spear passed and wounded the flesh of Odysseus. He slew the warrior who had wounded him, and he drew the spear from his flesh, but he had to give ground, but loudly as any man ever cried. Odysseus cried out to the other captains, and strong Aias heard him and drew near, bearing his famous shield that was like a tower. The Trojan warriors that were round him drew back at the coming of Aias, and Odysseus went from the press of battle, and mounting his chariot drove away. Where Aias fought, the Trojans gave way, and on that side of the battle they were being driven back towards the city. But suddenly upon Aias there fell an unaccountable dread. He cast behind him his great shield, and he stood in a maze, like a wild bull, turning this way and that, and slowly retreating before those who pressed towards him. But now and again his valor would come back, and he would stand steadily and with his great shield hold at bay the Trojans who were pressing towards the ships. Arrows fell thick upon his shield, confusing his mind, and Aias might have perished beneath the arrows if his comrades had not drawn him to where they stood, with shields sloping for a shelter, and so saved him. All this time Hector was fighting on the left wing of the battle against the Greeks, who were led by Nestor and Idomeneus. And on this side, Paris let fly an arrow that brought trouble to the enemies of his father's city. He struck Machaon, who was the most skilled healer of wounds in the whole of the host. And those who were around Machaon were fearful that the Trojans would seize the stricken man and bear him away. Then said Idomeneus, Nestor, arise, get Machaon into your chariot, and drive swiftly from the press of battle. A healer such as he is worth the lives of many men. Save him alive, so that we may still have him to draw the arrows from our flesh and put medicaments into our wounds. Then did Nestor lift the healer into his chariot, and the charioteer turned the horses, and they two drove from the press of battle and towards the hollow ships. 14. Achilles, standing by the stern of his great ship, saw the battle as it went this way and that way, but his heart was not at all moved with pity for the destruction wrought upon the Greeks. He saw the chariot of Nestor go dashing by, dragging by sweating horses, and he knew that a wounded man was in the chariot. When it had passed, he spoke to his dear friend Patroclus. Go now, Patroclus, he said, and ask of Nestor who it is that he has borne away from the battle. I go, Achilles, Patroclus said, and even as he spoke, he started to run along the line of the ships and to the hut of Nestor. He stood before the door, and when old Nestor beheld him, he bade him enter. Achilles sent me to you, revered Nestor, said Patroclus, to ask who it was you bore out of the battle wounded. But I need not ask, for I see that it is none other than Machaon, the best of our healers. Why should Achilles concern himself with those who are wounded in the fight with Hector? Said old Nestor. He does not care at all what evils befall the Greeks. But thou, Patroclus, wilt be grieved to know that Diomedes and Odysseus have been wounded, and that sore wounded is Machaon, whom thou seest here. Ah, but Achilles will have cause to lament when the host perishes beside our burning ships, and when Hector triumphs over all the Greeks. Then the old man rose up, and taking Patroclus by the hand, led him within the hut, and brought him to a bench beside which lay Machaon, the wounded man. Patroclus said, Nestor, speak thou to Achilles. Nay, but thy father bade thee spake words of counsel to thy friend. Did he not say to thee, turn Achilles from harsh courses by gentle words? Remember now the words of thy father, Patroclus, and if ever thou didst speak to Achilles with gentle wisdom, speak to him now. Who knows but thy words might stir up his spirit to take part in the battle we have to fight with Hector. Nay, nay, old man, said Patroclus, I may not speak to Achilles to ask for such a thing. Then said Nestor, do thou thyself enter the war and bring Achilles' Myrmidons with thee. Then might we who are wearied with fighting take breath, and beg of Achilles to give you his armor, that you may wear it in the battle. If thou wouldst appear clad in Achilles' bronze, the Trojans would think that he had entered the war again, and they would not force the fight upon us. What old Nestor said seemed good to Patroclus, and he left the hut and went back along the ships. And on his way he met Eurypylus, a sorely wounded man dragging himself from the battle, and Patroclus helped him back to his hut and cheered him with discourse and laid healing herbs upon his wounds. And even as he left old Nestor's hut, Hector was before the wall the Greeks had builded to guard their ships. On came the Trojans against that wall, holding their shields of bulls' hides before them. From the towers that were along the wall, the Greeks flung great stones upon the attackers. Over the host an eagle flew, holding in its talons a blood-red serpent. The serpent struggled with the eagle, and the eagle with the serpent, and both had sorely wounded each other. But as they flew over the host of Greeks and Trojans, the serpent struck at the eagle with his fangs, and the eagle, wounded in the breast, dropped the serpent. Then were the Trojans in dread, seeing the blood-red serpent cross their path, for they thought it was an omen from Zeus. They would have turned back from the wall in fear for this omen, had not Hector pressed them on. One omen is best, I know, he cried, to fight a good fight for our country. Forward then, and bring the battle to those ships that came to our coast against the will of the gods. So Hector spoke. Then he lifted up a stone, such a stone as not two of the best of men now living could as much as raise from the ground, and he flung this stone full at the strongly set gate. It spoke the hinges and the bars, and the great gate fell under the weight of the tremendous stone. Then Hector leaped across it with 2 spears in his hands. No warrior could withstand him now. And as the Trojans scaled the walls and poured across the broken gate, the Greeks fled to their ships in terror and dismay. Patroclus saw the gate go down with the Trojans pour towards the ships in a mass that was like a great rock rolling down a cliff. Idomeneus and Aias led the Greeks, who fought to hold them back. Hector cast a spear at Aias and struck him where the belt of his shield and the belt of his sword crossed. Aias was not wounded by the stroke. Then Aias cast at Hector a great stone that was used to prop up a ship. He struck him on the breast, just over the rim of his shield. Under the weight of that blow, great Hector spun round like a top. The spear fell from his hands, and the bronze of his shield and helmet rang as he fell on the ground. Then the Greeks dashed up to where Hector lay, hoping to drag him amongst them. But his comrades placed their shields around him and drove back the warriors that were pressing round. They lifted Hector into his chariot, and his charioteer drove him from the place of battle, groaning heavily from the hurt of that terrible blow. Now the Greeks rallied and came on with a shout, driving the Trojans back before them. The swift horses under Hector's chariot brought him out on the plain. They who were with him lifted him out, and Hector lay gasping for breath and with black blood gushing from him. And then as he lay there stricken, he heard the voice of a god, even of Apollo, saying, Hector, son of Priam, why dost thou lie fainting apart from the host? Dost thou not know that the battle is desperate? Take up thy spirit again. Bid thy charioteer drive these towards the ships of the Greeks. Then Hector rose and went amongst the ranks of his men, and roused up their spirits and led them back to the wall. And when the Greeks saw Hector in fighting trim again, going up and down the ranks of his men, they were affrighted. He mounted his chariot, and he shouted to the others, and the Trojan charioteers lashed their horses, and they came on like a great wave. They crossed the broken wall again and came near the ships. Then many of the Greeks got into their ships and struck at those who came near with long spikes. And all around the ships companies of Greek warriors stood like rocks, and the sea breaks against in vain. Nestor cried out to the Greeks, bidding them fight like heroes, or else lose in the burning ships all hope of returning to their native land. Aias, a long pike in his hand, drove multitudes of Trojans back, while in a loud voice he put courage into the Greeks. Hector fought his way forward, crying to the Trojans to bring fire to the ships that had come to their coast against the will of the gods. He came to the first of the ships and laid his hand upon its stern. Many fought against him there. Swords and spears and armor fell on the ground, some from the hands, some off the shoulders of warring men, and the black earth was red with blood. But Hector was not driven away from the ship, and he shouted, Bring fire that we may burn the ships that have brought the enemy to our land. The woes we have suffered were because of the cowardice of the elders of the city. They would not let me bring my warriors here and bring battle down to the ships. When first they came to our beach, do not let us return to the city until we have burned the ships with fire. But whoever brought fire near the ship was stricken by strong Aias, who stood there with a long pike in his hands. Now all this time Patroclus sat in the hut of Eurypylus, the wounded man he had succored, cheering him with discourse and laying healing herbs on his wounds. But when he saw fire being brought to the ships, he rose up and said, Eurypylus, no longer may I stay here, although great is your need of attendance. I must get aid for our warriors. Straightway he ran from the hut and came to where Achilles was. If thy heart, Achilles, he said, is still hard against the Greeks, and if thou wilt not come to their aid, let me go into the fight, and let me take with me thy company of Myrmidons. And, O Achilles, grant me another thing. Let me wear thine armor and thy helmet, so that the Trojans will believe for a while that Achilles has come back into the battle. Then would they flee before me, and our warriors would be given a breathing time. Said Achilles, I have declared that I shall not cease from my wrath until the Trojans come to my own ships. But thou, Patroclus, dear friend, mayest go into the battle. All thou hast asked shall be freely given to thee. The Myrmidons to lead, and my armor to wear, and even my chariot and my immortal horses. Drive the Trojans from the ships, but when thou hast driven them from the ships, return to this hut. Do not go near the city. Return, I bid thee, Patroclus, when the Trojans are no longer round the ships, and leave it to others to battle on the plain. Then Patroclus put on the armor that Zeus had given to Achilles, father Peleus. Round his shoulders he cast the sword of bronze with its studs of silver, and upon his head he put the helmet with its high horsehair crest, the terrible helmet of Achilles. Then Achilles bade the charioteer yoke the horses to the chariot, the horses Xanthos and Balios, that were also gifts from the gods. And while all this was being done, Achilles went amongst the Myrmidons, making them ready for the battle and bidding them remember all the threats they had uttered against the Trojans in the time when they had been kept from the fight. Then he went back to his hut, and opening the chest that his mother Thetis had given him, he took from it a four-handled cup, a cup that no one drank out of but Achilles himself. Then pouring wine into the cup and holding it towards heaven, Achilles prayed to Zeus, the greatest of the gods. My comrade I send to the war, O far-seeing Zeus. May it strengthen his heart, O Zeus, that all triumph be his. But when from the ships he hath driven the spear of our foes, out of the turmoil of battle may he to me return, scatheless with arms and his comrades who fight hand to hand. So Achilles prayed, and the Myrmidons beside their ships shouted in their eagerness to join in the battle. 15. Who was the first of the great Trojan champions to go down before the onset of Patroclus? The first was Sarpadan, who had come with an army to help Hector from a city beyond Troy. He was the Myrmidons fight round the ships. He saw the Myrmidons fight round the ships and break the ranks of the Trojans and quench the fire on the half-burnt ship. He saw that the warrior who had the appearance of Achilles affrighted the Trojans, so that they turned their horses' heads towards the city. The Myrmidons swept on with Patroclus at their head. Now when he saw him rushing down from the ship, Sarpadan threw a dart at Patroclus. The dart did not strike him. Then Patroclus flung a spear and struck Sarpadan even at the heart. He fell dead from his chariot, and there began a battle for his body. The Trojans would have carried it into the city, so that they might bury with all honor the man who had helped them, and the Greeks would have carried it away, so that having his body and his armor, the slaying of Sarpadan might be more of a triumph for them. So a battle for his body went on. Now Sarpadan's comrade Glaucus sought out Hector, who was fighting in another part of the battlefield, and he spoke to him reproachfully. Hector, he said, art thou utterly forgetful of those who came from their own country to help thee to protect thy father's city? Sarpadan has fallen, and Achilles' Myrmidons would strip him of his armor and bring his body to the ships, that their triumph over him may be greater still. Disgraceful will it be to thee, Hector, if they win that triumph. Hector, when this was said to him, did not delay, but came straight to the spot where Sarpadan had been slain. The Greek who had laid hands upon the body he instantly slew. But as he fought on, it suddenly seemed to Hector that the gods had resolved to give victory to the Greeks, and his spirit grew weary and hopeless within him. He turned his horses' heads towards the city and galloped from the press of battle. Then the Trojans who were fighting around it fled from the body of Sarpadan, and the Greeks took it and stripped it out of the armor and carried the body to their ships. It was then that Patroclus forgot the command of Achilles, the command that he was not to bring the battle beyond the ships, and that he was to return when the Trojans were beaten towards their city. Patroclus forgot all that, and he shouted to the immortal horses Xanthos and Balios that drew his chariot, and slaying warrior after warrior, he swept across the plain and came to the very gates of Troy. Now Hector was within the gates and had not yet left his chariot. Then there came and stood before him one who was thought to be the god Apollo, but who then had the likeness of a mortal man. Hector, said he, why hast thou ceased from the fight? Behold, Patroclus is without the gate of thy father's city. Turn thy horses against him now, and strive to slay him, and may the gods give thee glory. Then Hector bade his charioteer drive his horses through the gate and into the press of battle. He drew near to Patroclus, and Patroclus, leaping down from his chariot, seized a great stone and flung it at Hector's charioteer. It struck him on the brow and hurled him from the chariot. Hector too leaped from the chariot and took his sword in hand. Their men joined Patroclus and joined Hector, and the battle began beside the body of Hector's charioteer. 3 times did Patroclus rush against the ranks of the Trojans, and 9 warriors did he slay at each onset. But the doom of Patroclus was nigh. A warrior smote him in the back and struck the helmet from his head. With its high horsehair crest, it rolled beneath the hooves of the horses. Who was it smote Prince Patroclus then? Men said it was the god Apollo, who would not have the sacred city of Troy taken until the time the gods had willed it to fall. Spear fell from his hands, the great shield that Achilles had given him dropped on the ground, and all in amaze Patroclus stood. He gave ground and retreated towards his comrades. Then did Hector deal him the stroke that slew. With his great spear he struck and drove it through the body of Patroclus. Then did Hector exult, crying, Patroclus, thou didst swear that thou wouldest sack our sacred city, and that thou wouldest take from our people their day of freedom. Now thou hast fallen, and our city need not dread thee ever any more. Then said Patroclus, Thou mayest boast now, Hector, although it was not thy stroke that slew me. Apollo's stroke it was that sent me down. Boast of my slaying as thou wilt, but hear my saying and keep it in thy heart. Thy fate too is measured, and the Achilles will slay. But Hector did not heed what the dying Patroclus said. He took from his body the armor of Achilles that had been a gift from the gods. The body, too, he would have brought within the city that his triumph might be greater. But now Aias came to where Patroclus had fallen, and over the body he placed his great shield. The fight went on, and Hector, withdrawing himself to the plain, put upon himself the armor he had stripped off the body of Patroclus. The armor fitted every limb and joint, and as he put it on, more courage and strength than ever yet he had felt came into the soul of Hector. And the immortal steeds that Patroclus had driven, having galloped from the battle, stood apart and would not move for all that their charioteer would do. They stood apart with their heads bowed, and tears flowed from their eyes down on the ground. And Zeus, the greatest of the gods, saw them and had pity upon them, and spoke to himself, saying, Ah, immortal steeds, why did I give ye to King Peleus, whose generations die while ye remain young and undying? Was it that ye should know the sorrows that befall mortal men? Pitiful indeed is the lot of all men upon the earth. Even Hector now, who boasteth in the armor that the gods once gave, will shortly go down to his death, and the city he defendeth will be burned with fire. So saying, he put courage into the hearts of the immortal steeds, and they went where the charioteer would have them go, and they came safely out of the battle. Now Hector, with the armor of Achilles upon him, gathered his companies together and brought them up to the battle to win and carry away the body of Patroclus. But each one who laid hands upon that body was instantly slain by Aias. All day the battle went on, for the Greeks would say to each other, Comrades, let the earth yawn and swallow us, rather than let the Trojans carry off the body of Patroclus. And on their side the Trojans would say, Friends, rather let us all be slain together beside this man, than let one of us go backward now. Now Nestor's son, Antilochus, who was fighting on the left of the battlefield, heard of the slaying of Patroclus. His eyes filled with tears, and his voice was choked with grief, and he dashed out of the battle to bring the grievous tidings to the hunt of Achilles. Fallen is Patroclus, he cried, and Greeks and Trojans are fighting round his body, and his body is naked now, for Hector has stripped the armor from it. Then Achilles fainted away, and his head lay in the ashes of his hut. He woke again and moaned terribly. His goddess mother heard the sound of his grief as she sat within the depths of the ocean. She came to him as he was still moaning terribly. She took his hand and clasped it and said, My child, why weepest thou? Achilles ceased his moaning and answered, Patroclus, my dear friend, has been slain. Now I shall have no joy in my life save the joy of slaying Hector, who slew my friend. Thetis, his goddess mother, wept when she heard such speech from Achilles. Short-lived you will be, my son, she said, for it is appointed by the gods that after the death of Hector your death will come. Straightway, then let me die, said Achilles, since I let my friend die without giving him help. Oh, that I had not let my wrath overcome my spirit. Here I stayed a useless burthen on the earth, while my comrades and my own dear friend fought for their country. Here I stayed, I who am the best of all the Greeks. But now let me go into the battle and let the Trojans know that Achilles has come back, although he tarried long. But thine armor, my son, said Thetis, thou hast no armor now to protect thee in the battle. Go not into it until thou seest me again. In the morning I shall return, and I shall bring the armor that Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, shall make for thee. So she spoke, and she turned from her son, and she went to Olympus, where the gods have their dwellings. Now darkness had come down on those who battled round the body of Patroclus, and in that darkness more Greeks than Trojans were slain. It seemed to the Greeks that Zeus had resolved to give the victory to the Trojans and not to them. And they were dismayed, but 4 Greek heroes lifted up the body and put it upon their shoulders. And Aias and his brothers stood facing the Trojans, holding them back, while the 4 tried to bear the body away. The Trojans pressed on, striking with swords and axes, but like a wooded ridge that stretches across a plain and holds back a mighty flood, Aias and his brother held their ground. Achilles still lay in his hut, moaning in his grief, and the servants raised loud lamentations outside the hut. The day wore on, and the battle went on, and Hector strove against Aias and his brother. Then the figure of a goddess appeared before Achilles as he lay on the ground. Rouse thee, Achilles, she said, or Hector will drag into Troy the body of thy friend Patroclus. Said Achilles, Goddess Iris, how may I go into the battle, since the Trojans hold the armor that should protect me? Said Iris, the messenger of the gods, Go down to the wall as thou art, and show thyself to the men of Troy, and it may be that they will shrink back on seeing thee and hearing thy voice, and so give those who defend the body of Patroclus a breathing spell. So she said and departed. Then Achilles arose and went down to the wall that had been built around the ships. He stood upon the wall and shouted across the trench, and friends and foes saw him and heard his voice. Around his head a flame of fire arose, such as was never seen before around the head of a mortal man. And seeing the flame of fire around his head and hearing his terrible voice, the Trojans were affrighted and stood still. Then the Greeks took up the body of Patroclus and laid it on a litter and bore it out of the battle. 16. Now Thetis, the mother of Achilles, went to Olympus, where the gods had their dwellings, and to the house of Hephaestus, the smith of the gods. That house shone above all the houses on Olympus, because Hephaestus himself had made it of shining bronze. And inside the house there were wonders, handmaidens that were not living, but that were made out of gold and made with such wondrous skill that they waited upon Hephaestus and served and helped him as though they were living maids. Hephaestus was lame and crooked of foot and went limping. He and Thetis were friends from of old time, for when his mother would have forsaken him because of his crooked foot, Thetis and her sister reared him within one of the ocean's caves, and it was while he was with them that he began to work in metals. So the lame god was pleased to see Thetis in his dwelling, and he welcomed her and clasped her hand and asked of her what she would have him do for her. Then Thetis, weeping, told him of her son Achilles, how he had lost his dear friend, and how he was moved to go into the battle to fight with Hector, and how he was without armor to protect his wife. Seeing that the armor and the gods had once given his father was now in the hands of his foe, and Thetis besought Hephaestus to make new armor for her son, that he might go into the battle. She no sooner finished speaking than Hephaestus went to his workbench and set his bellows. 20 were there working, and the 20 bellows blew into the crucibles and made bright and hot fires. Then Hephaestus threw into the fires bronze and tin and silver and gold. He set on the anvil stand a great anvil, and took in one hand his hammer, and in the other hand his tongs. For the armor of Achilles he made first a shield, and then a corselet that gleamed like fire. And he made a strong helmet to go on the head, and shining greaves to wear on the ankles. The shield was made with 5 folds, 1 fold of metal upon the other, so that it was so strong and thick that no spear or arrow could pierce it. And upon this shield he hammered out images that were a wonder to men. The first were images of the sun and the moon and of the stars that the shepherds and the seamen watch, the Pleiades and Hyades and Orion and the bear that is also called Wain. And below he hammered out the images of 2 cities. In one there were people going to feasts and playing music and dancing and giving judgments in the marketplace. The other was a city besieged. There were warriors on the walls, and there was an army marching out of the gate to give battle to those that besieged him. And below the images of the cities he made a picture of a plowed field, with plowmen driving their yokes of oxen along the furrows, and with men bringing them cups of wine. And he made a picture of another field where men were reaping and boys were gathering the corn, where there was a servant beneath an oak tree making ready a feast, and women making ready barley for a supper for the men who were reaping, and a king standing apart and watching all, holding a staff in his hands and rejoicing at all he saw. And another image he made of a vineyard, and clusters of grapes that showed black, and with the vines hanging from silver poles. And he showed maidens and youths in the vineyard gathering the grapes into baskets, and one amongst them a boy who played on the viol. Beside the image of the vineyard he made images of cattle with herdsmen and with 9 dogs guarding them. But he showed 2 lions that had come up and had seized the bull of the herd, and the dogs and men strove to drive them away, but were affrighted. And beside the image of the oxen he made the image of a pasture land with sheep in it and sheepfolds and roofed huts. He made yet another picture, a dancing place with youths and maidens dancing, their hands upon each other's hands. Beautiful dresses and wreaths of flowers the maidens had on, and the youths had daggers of gold hanging from their silver belts. A great company stood around those who were dancing, and amongst them there was a minstrel who played on the lyre. Then all around the rim of the shield Hephaestus, the lame god, set an image of ocean, whose stream goes round the world. Not long was he in making the shield and the other wonderful pieces of armor. As soon as the armor was ready, Thetis put her hands upon it, and flying down from Olympus like a hawk, brought it to the feet of Achilles, her son. And Achilles, when he saw the splendid armor that Hephaestus, the lame god, had made for him, rose up from where he lay and took the wonderfully wrought piece in his hands, and he began to put the armor upon him. And none of the Myrmidons who were around could bear to look upon it, because it shone with such brightness, and because it had all the marks of being the work of a god. Chapter 17. Then Achilles put his shining armor upon him, and it fitted him as though it were wings. He put the wonderful shield before him, and he took in his hands the great spear that Chiron the centaur had given to Peleus his father, that spear that no one else but Achilles could wield. He bade his charioteer harness the immortal horses Xanthos and Balios. Then, as he mounted his chariot, Achilles spoke to the horses. Xanthos and Balios, he said, "This time bring the hero that goes with you back safely to the ships, and do not leave him dead on the plain as you left the hero Patroclus." Then Xanthos, the immortal steed, spoke, answering for himself and his comrade Achilles. He said, with his head bowed and his mane touching the ground, "Achilles, for this time we will bring thee safely back from the battle. But a day will come when you shall not bring thee back, when thou too shalt lie with the dead before the walls of Troy." Then was Achilles troubled, and he said, "Xanthos, my steed, why dost thou remind me by thy prophecies of what I know already, that my death too is appointed, and that I am to perish here, far from my father and my mother and my own land?" Then he drove his immortal horses into the battle. The Trojans were affrighted when they saw Achilles himself in the fight, blazing in the armor that Hephaestus had made for him. They went backward before his onset, and Achilles shouted to the captains of the Greeks, "No longer stand apart from the men of Troy, but go with me into the battle, and let each man throw his whole soul into the fight." And on the Trojan side, Hector cried to his captains and said, "Do not let Achilles drive you before him. Even though his hands are as irresistible as fire, and his fierceness as terrible as flashing steel, I shall go against him and face him with my spear." But Achilles went on, and captain after captain of the Trojans went down before him. Now amongst the warriors whom he caught sight of in the fight was Polydoros, the brother of Hector, and the youngest of all King Priam's sons. Priam forbade him ever to go into the battle because he loved him as he would love a little child. But Polydoros had gone in this day, trusting to his fleetness of foot to escape with his life. Achilles saw him and pursued him and slew him with the spear. Hector saw the death of his brother. Then he could no longer endure to stand aside to order the battle. He came straight up to where Achilles was brandishing his great spear. And when Achilles saw Hector before him, he cried out, "Here is the man who most deeply wounded my soul, who slew my dear friend Patroclus. Now shall we two fight each other, and Patroclus shall be avenged by me." And he shouted to Hector, "Now, Hector, the day of thy triumph and the day of thy life is at its end." But Hector answered him without fear, "Not with words, Achilles, can you affright me. Yet I know that thou art a man of might and a stronger man than I, but the fight between us depends upon the will of the gods. I shall do my best against thee, and my spear before this has been found to have a dangerous edge." He spoke and lifted up his spear and flung it at Achilles. Then the breath of a god turned Hector's spear aside, for it was not appointed that either he or Achilles should be then slain. Achilles darted at Hector to slay him with his spear, but a god hid Hector from Achilles in a thick mist. Then in a rage Achilles drove his chariot into the ranks of the war, and many great captains he slew. He came to Scamandros, the river that flows across the plain before the city of Troy. And so many men did he slay in it that the river rose in anger against him for choking its waters with the bodies of men. Then on towards the city he went like a fire raging through a glen that had been parched with heat. Now on a tower of the walls of Troy, Priam the old king stood, and he saw the Trojans coming in a rout towards the city. And he saw Achilles in his armor blazing like a star, like that star that is seen at harvest time and is called Orion's dog, the star that is the brightest of all stars, but yet is a sign of evil. And the old man Priam sorrowed greatly as he stood upon the tower and watched Achilles, because he knew in his heart whom this man would slay, Hector his son, the protector of his city.